Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. The conference season continues. This week it's the turn of Labour delegates to gather. We'll get the latest from Liverpool. Keir Starmer's comments about a possible border poll triggered a big reaction here. We'll speak to the two main nationalist parties. And here with his assessment of what we're discussing, Press Association's Ireland editor David Young. Last week it was the Tories, next week it's the DUP, and this weekend the focus is on the Labour Party as the party faithful come together for what might well be the last annual conference before the general election. So Keir Starmer certainly got people talking when he suggested the UK's relationship with the EU won't change dramatically if he becomes Prime Minister, and that, in his view, a border poll isn't on the horizon. Our political correspondent Gareth Gordon is in Liverpool for us, and just before we came on air, I asked him if there's a sense that this is the conference of a government in waiting.
Well, Mark, the last time there was as much attention focused on this particular venue was back in May. Of course, this was where the Eurovision Song Contest was held. Nul point, I have to say, for surmising that the answer to your question is absolutely. There's more of a buzz, even though the conference really hasn't got underway yet, about this particular conference, because this probably could be, well, probably is the last conference before the next general election. And it's a general election, if all the polls are telling us an accurate picture, a general election that could see the Labour government for the first time in, I think, 13 years. So there is no doubt there's a big anticipation for this conference and what Keir Starmer and the other Labour leaders are going to say to delegates.
Gareth, we'll be hearing from the party's new shadow Secretary of State later in the week, but that is certainly a heavyweight appointment by Keir Starmer.
It's an appointment, we think, with a view to the future. Hilary Benn is someone who's respected, I think, by all sides of the House. He is, as you say, a heavyweight politician. Of course, he was a prominent anti-Brexiteer. He's also been critical of the EU over the protocol. So this is a man who knows Northern Ireland very well. He's been surprisingly quiet, perhaps, since his appointment now just over a month ago. He made his first visit to Northern Ireland as Shadow Secretary of State just this week. He met the five main parties on the Hill at Stormont, and afterwards he spoke to the media, and he didn't give much away, it has to be said. I think he was treading very, very carefully, but all sides said they were impressed by how much he knew about the situation. He is a details man. He was probably reading himself in. That's maybe why we didn't hear from him for a month. But there's no doubt Hilary Benn is a serious proposition as Secretary of State if the voters make Labour the next government.
Gareth, we know about Keir Starmer's past involvement here in Northern Ireland. You asked him about the EU and a border poll just a couple of days ago, and to be honest, he seemed determined not to say very much about either issue.
Yeah, Keir Starmer, I think, says that his involvement with Northern Ireland in a previous life was what inspired him to become a politician. No doubt he knows that while Northern Ireland is probably not anywhere near the top of his agenda, it is a place that still presents him, or will present him if he's Prime Minister, with a lot of problems. He didn't give much away about the EU, you're absolutely right. On the border poll, there's a question I just got in right at the end. He was quite dismissive of the whole idea. He has said in the past, of course, he would vote in any border poll. He would campaign to keep Northern Ireland as part of the Union. He said a border poll wasn't even on the horizon. Those were remarks which were criticised by several nationalists, but nonetheless, that is what he said. Someone who knows Keir Starmer very well, who knows Northern Ireland very well, undoubtedly, is Baroness Angela Smith. She's the Labour leader in the House of Lords. Angela Smith joins me now. Angela Smith, what did you make, first of all, of those comments by Sir Keir Starmer about a border poll?
Yeah, my sense is that what Keir is really focused on Northern Ireland, and coming from his perspective, a lot of knowledge about Northern Ireland, is getting the Assembly up and running again, getting the institutions up and running again, and that's been the main focus. So the Good Friday Agreement is quite clear on a border poll. That's not the key issue at the moment. It is about the institutions and dealing with the protocol and the Windsor framework.
But Labour, if you don't mind me saying so, appears to have a little bit of a schizophrenic attitude to Irish unity. His predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, clearly was in favour of Irish unification, as much as Keir Starmer appears to be against it. Sir Keir Starmer batting away the idea of a border poll this week. But Louise Haigh, formerly his shadow Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, disagreed with him when Keir Starmer said he would campaign to keep Northern Ireland in the UK. She said she would be neutral on that. So, I mean, what is Labour's position on the Irish unity? Their sister party, of course, is the SDLP, which is a nationalist party. You do appear, not you personally, but Labour, to be all over the place.
Well, no, it's a matter for the people of Northern Ireland. It's not for me to say. It's people of Northern Ireland to have their say on that. And so there will be different views in the Labour Party. There'll be different views across Great Britain on this. But at the end of the day, the Good Friday Agreement is clear, and the people of Northern Ireland should make that decision, not people in London.
Well, why would Sir Keir Starmer then be planning to campaign against Northern Ireland leaving the UK? I mean, Labour does appear to be slightly schizophrenic on this. Does it depend who the Labour leader is at the time?
What it depends on is what the Good Friday Agreement says and what the people of Northern Ireland want. There are different views and people will have their own views, but it's not for London to make the decision on this. It will be a decision taken if there's a border poll, and what the result of that is will be taken in Northern Ireland. OK, well, we're not there yet. We are, mind you, stuck in a pretty big jam in Northern Ireland. You know what it's like to be a direct rule minister. You were parachuted in as one of the last direct rule ministers in 2002. At the moment, we don't have a government at Stormont. The DUP say they're not ready to go back in because they haven't got what they want on the Irish border. We have the civil servants saying there's not much more they can do. There's things they can't do, and the government don't want to intervene because they don't want to do anything. It looks like direct rule. I mean, how long can the situation be going on? What would Labour do about it? And it could be Labour's problem in the not too distant future. It could, but we would handle this very, very differently from the very start. You know, one of the things I've been critical of the government on is I don't think they've engaged enough with the political parties of Northern Ireland and the people of Northern Ireland on this. If you talk to businesses, you talk to people, I was over with Keir and Peter Kyle just a few months back. We want the institutions up and running again. That should happen now. We would also be having the kind of...
How do you force the DUP back in?
You don't force them, you just kind of have the discussions. You know, there's got to be some movement. At the end of the day, the institutions have to go back, don't they? That has to happen. Now, I was a direct rule minister. I was told you're going to be across there, could be 2 or 3 months, and you're going to come back to your job over here. I was there for 3.5 years. Once you get direct rule, it's much harder to get it away from direct rule and set up the institutions again from direct rule. And I think the government's got to have a more engaged process, at the same time having those discussions with the EU about the changes you can make to the protocol and the Windsor framework. The best person to do that, I have to say, is Hilary Benn, because Hilary Benn chaired the committee in the House of Commons on Brexit. So he knows the details and the intricacies of this. There has to be a way forward in the interest of Northern Ireland. You can't just have decisions being made in London for Northern Ireland.
So are you saying, if I can put it this way, no rule is better than direct rule?
No, I'm saying you have to get back to the institutions. And if you make a real effort, I believe it can happen. But it needs some hard...
Whoa, that's... I don't think that's somebody interjecting and objecting to what you're saying.
I don't think it was anything I said.
But
no.
that's just the way it is at a conference venue.
Yeah.
You can drag the DUP horse to water or to talks or negotiations, but you can't make it.
You can't, but you can do everything you can, and you've got to do more than is being done at the moment. Now, you look back at the Secretaries of State we had under a Labour government and the difficulties we had under a Labour government with Northern Ireland, but at no point were we not engaged as ministers, very serious, very senior people as Secretaries of State, and that's why you've seen Keir Starmer's been engaged from the very beginning. He's got a knowledge. You've had Peter Kyle, you've now got Hilary. You know, you've got serious people there to do a serious job, so we think we will continually engage. We do it in opposition, so we'll certainly be doing it in government.
I asked Hilary Benn the other day, would he be a better Secretary of State than Chris Heaton-Harris? And he didn't answer, but you could answer.
I can answer, absolutely. Yeah.
Seriously?
That's not a very high bar to set, I have to
say.
So
you don't think Chris Heaton-Harris has done a good job?
I think Hilary Benn will be much better. He'll be more engaged. He'll be more forensic on issues.
Well, we still have you. Let me ask you about legacy, another major problem. Keir Starmer's committed to repealing the Legacy Act. When we asked Hilary Benn about it this week, he seemed to talk about a replacement, and we weren't quite sure if it meant there had to be a replacement before there was repeal. If there's going to be a replacement, Keir Starmer didn't give me the impression the other day he knows what that is. He said he had some ideas, but as he also said, if this was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. Is there any way of getting anything people can agree on that would be better than what we've got now?
Well, let's start from that. The problem with the Legacy Act as it is now, is it united the Northern Ireland political parties like nothing else has done for a long time. They were all against it. Any victims groups, victims organisations, victims you spoke to, they were unhappy with it. So it didn't have the discussions and the buy-in from Northern Ireland in the first place. That's a big problem. So start from that principle. That's one of the reasons it's so fundamentally wrong. Then you start saying, how can we do this better? And we've been looking at this for some time now. What can you do that's better? I was Victims Minister way back when I was a minister in Northern Ireland, and we were grappling with some of those issues then. So it's not easy, but you don't do it from decisions made in London, in Westminster, without proper engagement.
Okay, Angela Smith, thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll see you later in the week. Obviously, at a number of fringe events, we don't know if Sir Keir Starmer is going to even mention Northern Ireland in his speech. He might not. There are a number of fringe events starting today, with one about the Labour's Euro movement. Hilary Benn will be speaking at it. Angela Smith will be speaking at it. Claire Hanna of the SDLP will be speaking at it. Sinn Féin tonight have their own event in another part of the city. But if we're looking for mentions of Northern Ireland, we may have to look to the fringes and maybe not the main conference hall, Mark.
Gareth Gordon there with Baroness Smith, and David Young has been listening to that. What did you make of what Angela Smith had to say? I mean, stout defence, no surprise, of Keir Starmer and of Hilary Benn.
I think Angela Smith and Keir Starmer and obviously the entire Labour Party, at the moment, they're clearly in a position where they're poised to potentially take the reins of power and win the next general election. So they're being very careful not to drop the ball. So in terms of Northern Ireland, it's not their main priority. And I suppose for them at the moment, the priority is not saying anything too contentious, anything too controversial. In that context, Sir Keir Starmer's comments about a border poll, they weren't really a surprise. They would have been surprised if he had said something substantive about a border poll, because at the moment he's campaigning to be the Prime Minister of the UK. So if he'd said anything that might give the Tories, ammunition to suggest that he will ultimately make a move that might result in the dismantling of the UK, clearly that wouldn't have been wise for him politically. So at the moment, I think the Labour's priority is to keep the show on the road, keep between the hedges, so to speak, until they get to number 10, and that's when I think we'll see more detail and more meat in the bone in terms of what their priorities for Northern Ireland.
But it is interesting because, of course, the SDLP is the Labour Party's sister party. It is pro-Irish reunification, and there are those within the Labour movement, not least the previous leader, who do support that, take a different view seemingly from Keir Starmer's. Well,
indeed, and I think this also feeds into the wider political situation across the entire UK, which is Keir Starmer's attempt to distance himself from the past regime and Jeremy Corbyn. I think that is key to winning back some of the votes, or a lot of the votes that he lost in 2019. So that's another context that you have to view his comments on Irish unity in that respect.
Interesting what Angela Smith had to say about the restoration of devolution. She says it's effectively the only show in town, that direct rule doesn't work. She was here for 2.5 years, and when you get direct rule up and running in the way that it was in the past, it's very hard to move on from that and to go back to the devolution project. That is a very clear message.
Well, indeed, and Labour have the first-hand knowledge, because they were the ones that filled those direct ministerial roles when the last time direct rule was in place. I think from Labour, and I suppose from the Tories' point of view as well, direct rule is an admission of failure in regard to the efforts to get power sharing back in the short term, because the introduction of direct rule is a longer term project. You're essentially accepting that Storm's down for a long period of time if you go to direct rule.
But just finally, to pick up on what Gareth Gordon was saying, let's imagine that Keir Starmer is successful and he is the Prime Minister. He can, if the circumstances prevail at the time, drag potentially the DUP horse to water, but he cannot make it drink.
There are certainly a lot of people within the DUP, and this has been the case for a while, who are looking beyond the next election and basically pinning their colours to Keir Starmer's mast in regard to he may be the person to deliver the changes they need in regard to the Windsor framework. The problem is that, as willing as Keir Starmer might be, he needs a willing partner in the EU, and at the moment I just don't detect the willingness among the bloc to make any substantive changes. So that's going to be Keir Starmer's real challenge if he does take power.
OK, David, for now, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk to you a bit later in the programme. Let's talk more about those comments from Sir Keir Starmer that a border poll is not on the horizon. His suggestion that talk of a border poll is hypothetical is interesting because in the past he's, as we say, pledged to campaign for the Union in any future referendum. And his previous Shadow Secretary of State even promised that a Labour government would set out the criteria for a border poll. So let's discuss that with Sinn Féin's John O'Dowd, who's with me in the studio, and the SDLP's Claire Hanna, who joins me from the airport where she's about to travel to the Labour conference in Liverpool. And while we definitely have you there, Claire Hanna, in case your flight is called, I want to ask you what you make of what you've just heard from Angela Smith, a stout defence of both Keir Starmer and Hilary Benn, walking a fine line and trying not to put a foot wrong.
Yeah, and as I think David said, you'd understand that they're campaigning in Britain. So to run towards saying, yes, we are initiating the breakup of the union wouldn't be a sensible strategy. But to be fair, I think Keir Starmer's comments were overinterpreted. Saying something isn't on the horizon isn't the same as ruling it out. But the fact is, the Good Friday Agreement is very, very clear. When a majority seems likely for a border poll, it is a decision for us, the people here, in all of our diversity, to make together. I don't think anything that he says changes that. I don't even think that it undermines us. It is true that moment isn't right now, and there's a lot of work to be done to prepare for it, to look at not just the when and how a border poll is called, although that's a conversation Democratic Ireland needs to have, but also the why and the what we're going to do with it and the prospectus that we're going to put before people.
OK, but it is a tricky one for the SDLP, isn't it? Because the Labour Party is your sister party. And here we have the leader of that party, the man who could very well be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, saying he doesn't believe a border poll is on the horizon. He's the person ultimately who's going to interpret the Good Friday Agreement and decide if the circumstances are right for that border poll to be called. And it doesn't sound as if he's about to do that or would be in a hurry to do that.
But so I don't think very many people think a border poll is about to be called. Yes, we are sister parties, both proudly members of the Party of European Socialists. I don't know if you have sisters. I have two. We have very similar values, but we have different lives and we have different jobs and we make different decisions and say different things on a day-to-day basis. He clearly has not. And I think it's important to say, similar to Leo Varadkar's comments when people lost their minds about him expressing his desire and preference for a new Ireland. We need to get to a place where we don't go mad whenever people express their personal opinions. The Good Friday Agreement is clear, the legislation is clear, and I think we will have two premiers who are clear about their responsibilities and how to take things forward. And I think that for the conversations, for the detailed conversation about the protection of rights, about financial arrangements and the practicalities of a new Ireland, I think Keir Starmer is a far better Prime Minister than the one we currently have when that detailed conversation properly gets underway, as we believe it should, because we think there is a direction of travel here, and we firmly believe that, particularly because the DUP have told us that devolution in the UK is no longer on offer. They're trying to make the status quo miserable. Many people are actively looking towards a new Ireland as the way to get the basics of good governance and to fulfil the potential of everybody here.
OK, let me bring in John O'Dowd at this point. Was the previous Shadow Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, flying a kite, or was he speaking out of turn when he said a future Labour government would set out the criteria for a border poll? Doesn't sound like that's what Hilary Benn or Keir Starmer or Angela Smith think.
Well, I think we are reading too much into what Keir Starmer said. Though I will say this, anyone in his position who believes that they're going to become the next British Prime Minister needs not only to look at the horizon, but what's beyond the horizon. And quite clearly sailing towards him is an Irish unity referendum. And he needs to prepare for that.
Well,
so
he'll be the person who decides. So you can't say it's sailing towards him. I mean, if he doesn't want there to be one, he won't call one.
Well, then he's undemocratic. And that's a challenge then for whoever's in 10 Downing Street. That would be an undemocratic decision. If the conversation here in the north and across the island of Ireland is about constitutional change, and there's clearly a conversation taking place among nationalist Republicans, unionists and others about the constitutional future of this place, then there's a responsibility of whoever occupies 10 Downing Street to respond to that in a democratic way.
OK, but you know the line from the Good Friday Agreement. It's if the Secretary of State, presumably on the instructions or with the advice of the Prime Minister, believes a majority would vote for constitutional change. That is a high bar, and Sinn Féin signed up to it.
It is a high bar, we are working to the Good Friday Agreement, and we expect others to work to the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think that's too much to ask. So Keir Starmer has made a comment in response to a question, which I think has been misinterpreted by many, and I suppose from whatever point of the argument you come from, people try to build on from their point of view.
Well, hang on. He says he doesn't believe a border poll is on the horizon. You're saying you believe it is on the horizon. It's not a question of interpretation. He says not on the horizon. You're trying to tell me it is on the horizon.
I believe it is coming towards us now. Is it going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or next year? No, I don't think it will. But I do think there's a responsibility on leaders across these islands to prepare for it and to be open to the possibility of it occurring, because we have had 10 or 11 years of Tory rule. We have had Tory Prime Ministers and Tory Secretaries of States who see their role as representing unionism. What their real role is to represent the people who have points of view here and represent the Good Friday Agreement. So let's have an open, transparent, good conversation about the hopes and aspirations of all the people who live in this island, not simply from people in authority such as Secretaries of State and British Prime Ministers about what the needs of unionism are. I'm not saying we ignore the needs of unionism, but we have to have an inclusive conversation.
But does it not say something about the state of the debate and the persuasive powers of Irish nationalism, that despite 13 years of what you would characterise presumably as Tory misrule, and despite the fact that we've got this ongoing hiatus in the devolution project in Northern Ireland, more people are not being persuaded of the benefits, as you see it, of a border poll and a united Ireland?
But I think more people are being persuaded of it. The conversation has moved on quite significantly over this last number of years. More and more people are involved in it. And the very fact that you and I are...
More and more, yes, John, but not a clear majority.
No, not a clear majority. Yeah. But here's the thing. You prepare for constitutional change, and we have to learn the mistakes in the Brexit referendum. There was no preparation for change. I think most commentators, if the open and fair discussion, would say there's a likelihood of constitutional change in this island, so let's prepare for it.
OK, let me bring Claire Hanna in just for one more point before you've got to go and get your flight to Liverpool. 2 years ago, exactly 2 years ago, in fact, on The View, we brought all the nationalist parties together on the programme to ask about preparations for a border poll and any plans you might have between you to adopt a common position. And in truth, it doesn't sound as if those parties, North and South, are any further on now maybe than they were back then. Is that a fair comment?
No, I don't think that's true. And I think people do have different approaches. The SDLP has the New Ireland Commission up and running more actively than it had been before. We've established our principles for a New Ireland for the process, and we have been very clear that we will be putting reconciliation and empathy at the heart of that. You're right that the meat and bones, the practicalities, as I say, protection of rights, financial issues, how we strengthen East-West, British-Irish relations. We haven't started talking Turkey on that, which is, okay, I guess, what Starmer means about things not being on the horizon. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. There is a job of persuasion to do, but I think people genuinely are discussing it. And as I say, the fact that you can't have the basics of government within the status quo, that is a very, very real driver. But of course, there's work to do.
All right, Claire Hanna, thank you very much indeed. John O'Dowd, I want to ask you a couple of things just before we go here. On the government's talks with the DUP, has Sinn Féin had any specific briefing on where that stands and what we might hear from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson at his party conference on Saturday coming? No. We are engaging with the British government and the Irish government about the way forward. We have said to them that any proposals that are brought forward by the British government to the DUP cannot infringe on the Good Friday Agreement. And it's highly unlikely, in fact, I think you should be nearly put your house on it, that the British government is not going to infringe on the Windsor Framework either. So whatever is going on between those two parties,
needs to be brought out into the open and discussed among all the parties. But what we have said to the British government is this: the restoration of the institutions also requires significant financial input.
OK, all right. One final question I want to ask you about. John O'Dowd, your Sinn Féin colleague, was tweeting about Hamas's surprise attack on Israel on Friday night. And he tweeted his support for the Palestinian cause. Palestinians must be free to live without oppression, apartheid and colonisation, he said. What is the official position of Sinn Féin regarding this specific Hamas attack?
Well, I think you referred to John O'Dowd. I'm John O'Dowd.
Oh, sorry. Chris Hazard tweeted. I beg your pardon.
Well, we have set out our position. There was a statement yesterday from my colleague Matt Carty, TD. We have set out our position. There needs to be an immediate ceasefire. There's a humanitarian crisis happening now in Palestine and in Israel, and the ceasefires need to be called by both sides, and the international community needs to step in and ensure that the rights and entitlements of Palestinians are protected, that civilians are protected, and that international law is upheld, something that has failed to happen to date.
So your message to both the Israelis and to Hamas is to cease hostilities?
Call a ceasefire immediately, and the international community to live up to their obligations in that region. OK, we'll leave it there. John O'Dowd and Claire Hanna, thanks both very much indeed for coming in to join us. Just time for a final word from David Young, who's been listening to that. On the issue of a possible border poll, it is obvious from what we talked about earlier and from the conversation there between my two most recent guests that is continuing to be hotly contested, and it's not quite clear. There is no single narrative.
Indeed. And I think the challenge for John and for Claire is that before we get to the point of a border poll being called, what nationalism and republicanism needs to do is to get to a position where the government lay out the criteria. Because that's what's missing at the moment. Because everything, all the talk about a border poll, one opinion poll can say one thing, one opinion poll can say the other. Some people look to the census, some people look to election results. Until you actually get, a measuring scale upon which to assess when the criteria, because obviously we know at the moment it's so vague within the Good Friday Agreement at the moment. Until we get detail around that, I don't think the debate around when a border poll might actually be called is going to move forward that much. And obviously from unions' point of view,
know what the criteria are.
Exactly.
And that's the interesting thing. Peter Kyle's contribution now seems to have been knocked into history.
And from unionism's perspective, it's good to have that vague, because it's it's subjective, and until there's that concrete criteria set down, it's very difficult to get to the position where that could be called. OK,
David, this time next week we will presumably be reflecting on the DUP conference. How far do you think Sir Geoffrey Donaldson will go in what he will say to the party faithful next Saturday?
Well, I don't think the people that are maybe predicting a sudden breakthrough, I don't think that's going to come to pass this week. The DUP are expecting new proposals from the government, but I was speaking to someone at the weekend who I would view as a very much a devolutionist, and they said there's still some way to go. So I don't think there's any sort of sense that there's an imminent breakthrough coming. Obviously, it depends what the government present to the DUP this week, but certainly from the conversations between the two sides over the summer, I don't think there's a sense that there's going to be a major package laid down, because clearly from Rishi Sunak's point of view, in order for him to lay a major package down for the DUP, he's going to have to basically unpick the Windsor framework, and he's no appetite to do that, especially in the context of his own electoral chances, which to a degree hinges on the small boats issue. So he certainly doesn't want to upset the EU in that respect. OK, all right. Leave it there. David, thank you as ever. That is all we've got time for today. I'll have a new episode of our Red Lines podcast on Wednesday. That'll be available on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. And I'll be back with The View on Thursday night after the 10 o'clock news on BBC One. For now, from all of us, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.